It was a vast empire in the East, but it stayed in the Middle Ages for too long, in fact, well into the 19th century. And when it finally came out of it, there was a lot of social, economic, and political unrest, leading to the overthrow of the monarchy, but unfortunately replacing it with a totalitarian and an authoritarian regime. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about Russia and the changes it underwent from the late 19th century to the earlier part of the 20th century, leading up to becoming a totalitarian regime. Much of Western Europe viewed Russia as an underdeveloped, backward society. Actually, Russian Empire practiced serfdom well into the 19th century. Serfdom meaning a form of practice where landless peasants were forced to serve the landowning nobility. In contrast, the practice had died in Western Europe by the end of the Middle Ages. It was actually Tsar Alexander II who in 1861 issued his emancipation reform, abolishing serfdom and allowing peasants to purchase land. However, the emancipation of the serfs was going to influence the events leading up to the Russian Revolution because the peasants now got the freedom to organize. Russia also industrialized much later than Western Europe. And when it started introducing industrialization, it did around the turn of the 20th century, and that brought in a lot of social and political change. Actually, between 1890 and 1910, the population of major Russian cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow nearly doubled, resulting in overcrowding and destitute living conditions of a new class of Russian industrial workers. The Bolshevik October Revolution of 1917 is often looked upon as the event that ended the monarchy in Russia. But that's not accurate. Around January of 1905, a wave of strikes were planned by some of the organization of workers, and these broke out in St. Petersburg. And finally, to quell the protesters, the security chief ordered his men to fire upon the demonstrators, and this led to more than 100 marchers being killed and several hundred being wounded. This ended up being known as the Bloody Sunday, and this led to a series of strikes in other cities, peasant uprisings in the country, and mutineers in the armed forces. So much so that the entire regime of the Tsar came under threat, and this ended up being known as the Revolution of 1905. What was the outcome of this? Political reform. On October the 30th, faced with a general strike across the country, Emperor Nicholas II issued a manifesto that promised that the country would get a legislative parliament. Within a year, Russia got a constitution. Elections took place to a representative body, the State Duma, which was empowered to initiate and veto legislative proposals, and the population received guarantees of fundamental civil liberties. So the setup almost appeared like a democratic setup with the monarch at the helm. The Constitution of 1906, though, was frequently violated by the government and the opposition. But during this time, Russia enjoyed greater freedom than it ever had before. And it also enjoyed relative prosperity because it was the world's leading producer of petroleum and a net exporter of grain. Conditions in the countryside had gradually improved, and by 1916, peasants owned or rented about 90% of the arable land. And then Russia decided to enter World War I in August of 1914 in support of the Serbs and their French and British allies. Now, at that time, Russia was nowhere at the level of industrialization as Germany, and it totally underestimated the scale and magnitude of the involvement in World War I. It was no surprise that Russia suffered the largest number of deaths in the war, over 1.8 million military deaths and about 1.5 million civilian deaths. The prestige of the monarchy had already been reduced due to the humiliation of Russia during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905-06, and now with World War I, where it again got humiliated by Germany, the monarchy started becoming more and more inconsequential. And to add to all this, there were rumors that Empress Alexandra, who was German by origin, had betrayed the military by passing secrets to the enemy. And around this time also, a mystic by the name of Grigory Rasputin came to prominence because it is said that the Crown Prince Alexei, who was born with hemophilia, was cured by Rasputin. Now Tsar Nicholas II decided to lead the forces in World War I, and during this time Rasputin ended up influencing the decisions of the court through the queen, and the nobles were nervous that he was going to make peace with the Germans during World War I, so they decided to hatch a plot to assassinate him, and on December 30th, 1916, he was poisoned, thereby ending his influence on the monarchy. But by then, the people had lost faith in the leadership of the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas II himself, though, was a very reluctant leader. When he was crowned in 1894, he seemed very bewildered, and it's said that he asked, what is going to happen to me, to all of Russia? I'm not prepared to be Tsar. I never ever wanted to become one. And the waning credibility of the monarchy experienced another blow when in November of 1916, the head of the Liberal Constitutional Democratic Party, during a session of the Duma, implied that the government was guilty of treason. Actually, what had happened was that during the severe winter of 1916 through 1917, the food and fuel deliveries to major cities had drastically declined. And as a result, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the government's conduct of the war, the economic hardships, and all this bubbled up into an outburst of fury around February of 1917. Technically, it was March 8, 1917, but because Russia was still following the Julian calendar, which it did until February of 1918, this ended up being called the February Revolution. Demonstrators clamoring for bread took to the streets of Petrograd, and supported by huge crowds of striking industrial workers, the protesters clashed with police, but just refused to leave the streets. And Petrograd was really the name given to St. Petersburg between 1914 and 1924, because at that time the Russians felt that St. Petersburg was too German. So the protests continued unabated, and finally the troops of the Petrograd army garrison were called out to quell the uprising. In some instances, the troops did open fire, killing demonstrators, but the protesters kept to the streets, and slowly the troops also began to waver. Finally, Tsar Nicholas II was persuaded by his generals that he and his wife were the main obstacles to victory. And subsequently, Tsar Nicholas II agreed to abdicate. Yes, the monarchy came to an end not because of the Bolshevik Revolution, but because of the February Revolution that was initiated by the common populace. The Duma formed a provisional government on March the 12th, and finally, centuries of the Russian Romanov rule came to an end. The leaders of the provisional government included a young Russian lawyer, Alexander Kerensky, and he, led the establishment of a liberal program of rights such as freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the right of unions to organize and strike. Yes, Russia seemed to be turning democratic. So Russia is ready for a democracy? It appears to be, but let's pause for a minute and see what political parties exist in this setup. When it came to revolutionary parties, meaning the more extremists, there were three principal parties in Russia. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, whose main support base was the peasantry, but they resorted to political terror. And in the first decade of the century, members of this party assassinated a lot of government officials, hoping that they would bring down the government in this way. On the moderate side, there were the Social Democrats, and they followed the classic doctrines of Karl Marx, which meant they believed that the development of capitalism would lead to a revolution by the proletariat and introduce socialism. In 1903, the Social Democrats split into two factions, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were more extremist as compared to the Mensheviks, and their leader, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, was a fanatical revolutionary who believed strongly that Russia was ready for socialism and his party needed to be in power. And how did Lenin come to the forefront? Well, during World War I, Lenin, while living in Switzerland, agitated for Russia's defeat. And this attracted the attention of the Germans, who felt that they could use Lenin to induce Russia signing a peace treaty. And to that effect, they arranged Lenin's transit through Germany on to Russia, where they hoped the Bolsheviks would fan anti-war sentiment, and they generously supplied Lenin with the money needed to organize the party and build up a press. So Lenin arrived in Russia around April 1917, and at that time the Tsar had already abdicated, and there was a little bit of instability in the government, so he felt this was the right time to strike, and he decided to launch an uprising. Majority of the Bolsheviks, though, were skeptical that this uprising would succeed, and their fears were proven correct when in July 1917, when they did launch a uprising to overthrow the government released information on Lenin's dealings with the Germans, which upset the troops, and they immediately dispersed the rebels to end the uprising. And at that point, Lenin had to flee to Finland. Soviet Union, or the USSR, that is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So what does the word Soviet mean? The Soviets were literally legislative councils at different levels and had started during the later part of the monarchy. And by the time Russia turned into a communist state, the Soviets were the basic form of government in the USSR. So factory and village Soviets would send delegates to town Soviets, and then town Soviets would send delegates to the regional Soviet, and finally all the way up to the center, which was the Supreme Soviet. So after the failed July 1917 Bolshevik rising, Alexander Kerensky took chairmanship of the provisional government in Russia. Now at that time, the All-Russian Soviet was dominated by the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks. And Kerensky did not want to upset the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, so he decided not to prosecute the Bolsheviks for the uprising. Instead, he started looking at the conservative General Lev Kornilov as his rival. And to get him out of his way, he's supposed to have informed Kornilov that the Bolsheviks were planning another coup in Petrograd in September, and requesting him to send troops to suppress it. And when Kornilov did that, he supposedly announced that Kornilov was trying to topple the government. Kornilov was upset and he mutinied, but the mutiny was easily crushed. So Kerensky, though he felt good that he had eliminated competition, but what happened was he ended up alienating all the core of the defense and military who were close to Kornilov. And this incident also sent the message that the provisional government was basically incompetent, and it encouraged the Bolsheviks to reattempt their coup, and this time they had a new leader in Lenin Trotsky. So the Bolshevik Central Committee decided to seize power at a clandestine meeting during October of 1917. There were disagreements, and folks like Lenin wanted the coup to be carried out immediately, whereas Trotsky felt that the coup needed to be executed at a more opportune moment. Finally, Trotsky prevailed, and Lenin returned to his hideaway, and the direction was to have Trotsky run with the coup. To carry out the coup, the Bolshevik also built up an armed force, essentially the Red Guards. On the night of October 24th and 25th, the Bolshevik Red Guards occupied strategic points in Petrograd, and on the morning of October 25th, Lenin re-emerged from his hideaway and issued a declaration in the name of the military that the provisional government had been overthrown and all power was assumed by the Soviets. Kerensky tried to rally support among the troops to suppress this uprising, but then he had already lost support due to the treatment that had been meted out to Kornilov. And on October 26, the Congress of Soviets, which would later become the Supreme Soviet, confirmed the transfer of power and passed several decrees submitted to it by Lenin, including one that socialized non-peasant private land. It also declared the formation of a new provisional government chaired by Lenin that was to administer until the new Constituent Assembly was convened. Now, as I had stated earlier in the episode, that the Bolshevik overthrow was not really a revolution. The revolution was the February 1917 revolution, which was spontaneous, the people rising against the monarch, which led to the end of the monarchy. The October 1917 uprising was a planned coup against the government. So it is not right to call it the October Revolution. Actually, it should be the February Revolution and the October coup. So the new Constituent Assembly was supposed to be elected by November of 1917, but the Bolsheviks procrastinated. But finally, when they allowed elections to proceed, the results were 40.4% majority to the socialist revolutionaries, and the Bolsheviks getting a mere 24% of the vote. Lenin allowed the assembly to meet for just one day, January the 5th, 1918, and then shut it down. And that was the end of the last vestige of democracy in Russia. In the months that followed, parties were outlawed, non-Bolshevik newspapers were closed, and all opposition was suppressed by a new secret police, the Cheka, which was given unlimited authority to arrest and shoot at its discretion any suspected counter-revolutionaries. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was the new dictator of Russia. And it is here that we conclude this section of today's episode. On to the quiz section. Question from the last episode. Which country has the highest average gold medal count per Olympic it participated in? With an average of 44 golds per Olympiad and 112 total medals per Olympiad, the Soviet Union ranks number one in the best average medals received per Olympiad participated in? So the answer is B, the erstwhile Soviet Union. On to the question for this week's episode. True or false? Anastasia Romanov, the daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, did she survive the execution or no? In other words, when Tsar Nicholas and his family were supposedly executed in July of 1918, did their daughter Anastasia survive the execution? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in this week's episode. In the next episode, we take a holistic view across the globe and look at the worst famines in the history of the 20th century, and we'll be amazed at some of the commonalities we'll find across them. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.